Hello, all. This is Dr. Dave Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3, and in this particular video, I want to talk about how PhD students are actually evaluated. So, if you don't know me, I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out during graduate school and to allow me to become a professor that I wanted to create something that I was paying the favor forward. And so I created this sharing economy proofreading platform called reciprocity.com. And on that, you can get feedback on your own writing. But then the more important thing is I'm doing these YouTube videos because there's really nobody that's talking openly about graduate school and just being a real person with dealing with sort of graduate school stuff and going through it. So how are PhD students actually evaluated anyways? It's a lot more trickier than what you think it is. So in the first couple of years, when you are doing your coursework, it's pretty easy to evaluate PhD students because you have these courses, and what you do is, or the students will read some material, and then they will get a grade on a paper that they write or on some sort of thing, end product at the end of the semester that they get. It's pretty easy to judge the sort of intellectual contributions of those people, of the PhD students and graduate students at that moment. So evaluation is a lot more straightforward. It's pretty near what it would be like if you're doing a master's program or if you were actually doing an undergraduate degree. It's very similar to the same sort of style. It's just a lot more work. It's a lot more rigorous, and the expectations are a lot higher. You're competing against a smaller cohort of people that are actually the most outstanding of the particular classes, right? So if you think of, there is a vetting process that happens in high school, you go to the best universities, and those people will go to the best. The best of those people will go to a master's program, and then the best of those people will go and do a PhD program if they're motivated to do it, right? So that's another component of it. So you have to think about that sort of vetting process, and then at that moment you're competing against people that are really world class, that are pretty outstanding. Doesn't matter what university you're at. They're going to be outstanding. They're going to be very, very challenging. Some universities are going to be a lot better in terms of students than others, but it just really depends on where you are, and in general that they are all going to be world class and pretty outstanding individuals that are out there. So as you move towards doing, like, later on in your PhD program, what you are more weighted on is your intellectual contributions, and that is really thinking about the articles that you're actually writing. And it really is a tricky thing. A lot of people don't realize this, that there is a trade-off, or there's an interaction between the quantity and quality of the publications that you're actually doing, the articles that you're writing. So that's the end goal when you're a PhD student, is to write articles. That article is going to have some really cool idea or a bunch of cool ideas in the paper that is going to help other people in the future sort of understand the world a little bit better than what they did in the past. That's really what an article is a new idea where people are being able to sort of understand the world a little bit more in a clearer way than what they did in the past. And some of these ideas and some of these articles have just a lot more ideas that sort of help people see clearly than others. And that's really what we're talking about with quality. It's just thinking about the world in a lot more sharper way, or it just gives a little bit more help for people sort of understanding the world around them. And so you can write a bunch of papers that are not as clear, and they just don't sort of illustrate the same sort of way, or you can write sort of really great in-depth papers. And the odd person can do both of those, and it's extremely uncommon that they can do both of those. And we know this from a lot of strategy research, actually, that most companies and most sort of things around the world are just resource constrained, and they just can't do both of those things because they take a lot of resources to do either one of those. And so what they end up doing is choosing one or the other and picking one over the other. And now, if you write a lot of publications and you have lots and lots of different publications, it's really clear in terms of your intellectual contributions, and you could probably have a pretty good understanding of where somebody stands. It's less clear if somebody only has a few ideas. but these ideas are really sharp and they're really clear, and they help people see the world in a much more sort of plain way or clear way than what they thought before. And then it becomes really murky in terms of understanding what an intellectual contribution is. And so this is a fundamental battle. At that moment, you sort of cross the lines from a PhD student to understanding what it's like to be a really true academic, where it's not necessarily clear on what the ideas are and what's actually going on around the world. And it's a very subjective endeavor. And one way that you can determine how important the particular ideas are is who and what are paying attention to those particular ideas that you are publishing. There is, it's not just necessarily citations that you're getting, but also who's actually listening to, who is in the group of people that you're actually listening to and talking to. That's an important sort of way to think about that. And that's why letters of recommendation, for example, are really important in academia. People don't really realize that when you're first starting out, but it is truly important to have letters of recommendation from people that, that sort of understand your research and actually can say something about what you're actually doing. And it's a qualitative field. It truly is that when you're doing something, or people that are working on sort of really cool projects and they just can't clearly see, other people can see what you're doing, but the sort of intellectual contributions are just not that, they just don't have the same numbers as other people. And that's kind of the battle that people are always facing in academia, is this sort of trade-off between quality and quantity of publications. It's a really real thing. And so what ends up happening is that PhD students are really, they are evaluated subjectively, just like everybody else, eventually. So at the beginning, it's a lot more objective. Like undergrad, when you're doing an undergrad, it's much more objective than when it gets into graduate school. It starts getting more and more subjective, and then you're kind of weighing the ideas and sort of making judgments on what these particular ideas are at the moment. And then the other tricky thing is with this is that sometimes intellectual contributions or sometimes articles are not necessarily big intellectual contributions early on, but they make a big contribution later on, and they sort of change in the future. There's one person that actually that's striking for me in terms of what ended up happening is Edith Penrose. I don't know if you've ever heard of her, but she really wasn't, didn't have the same sort of intellectual contribution as people around her from her in the sort of time that she was around. So I think she was in the 50s and 60s, and she was really smart and really bright, and she wrote this book about the growth of the firm. And it really did not start taking off until, I would say, the mid 80s, even the 90s, where it actually started taking off and becoming influential, like seriously influential, and sort of changing the ideas about how people understand how firms grow, right? And in the growth of the firm, and it becomes influential in our field. And so she was basically toiling away doing her thing, and she was obviously bright and was still an academic and all that kind of stuff, but her contributions really didn't take off until far into the future, until it was like 30, 40 years into the future. And there's lots of people that have the same sort of experience. So it's not clear with these contributions and what they matter, or when they matter, or when they will matter. And so it really takes somebody that can say something about what you're trying to do and what you are sort of accomplishing, to say something about that. And that's why it's really subjective in terms of what a good idea is and what an intellectual contribution is. And that's why it's really hard to evaluate PhD students early on, or especially, so it's harder early. Sorry about that. It's harder to evaluate PhD students early on compared to when it's later on. So you can evaluate, and later on being 20, 30 years out, and then you can evaluate what's actually happening with those particular individuals a little bit more clearly. Sort of basic statistics, right? But it's the kind of thing that does matter in terms of somebody's career. And so early on, there is often this subjective understanding in how PhD students are actually being evaluated and what they are actually doing. So don't be afraid with this. This is welcome to academia if you're sort of experiencing this for the first time, and it'll probably happen when you're about your third year of your PhD. and it starts feeling a little bit murky, and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing here. Well, that's academia. We really all don't know what we're doing, and we can only sort of judge the ideas by reading and thinking about them. And it's not going to be clear what they actually are until they actually start making a difference in the world, however that might be, right? So that's really what it is. And hopefully this is helpful for you in terms of video, in terms of thinking about how PhD students are actually evaluated. Early on, definitely in terms of the publication, or not, in terms of the courses that they're actually doing and doing the sort of papers and things like that. So often what you'll do early on is you'll get a paper, and then you'll write a paper for a course, and maybe you submit it to a conference, and hopefully it gets submitted and gets accepted at a conference. And then, you get a couple of small wins that way. And then later on, you start working on journal publications and start moving along that way. And hopefully working on some of your own ideas and working with other people that are doing the similar sort of thing, and then thinking about these sort of bigger ideas, as well as smaller ones. You want to start sort of balancing all that kind of stuff, because that's what we do, and that's why it's so fun to think about this kind of stuff in terms of new ideas, right? New ideas are not necessarily all that clear. They're not necessarily all that good when they start out, but once you start working on them, they get better and better. So that's how PhD students are actually evaluated. Very much more objectively at the beginning, a lot more subjectively at the end. It's not necessarily all that clear, and it takes expert judgment at the end on what's actually going on with those particular PhD students. And that's why sometimes it's difficult to get jobs. And that's why sometimes it looks strange, and somebody not having a lot of publications getting jobs, and some people that have lots of publications getting jobs. It's just they're being subjectively evaluated on what their performance is. And sometimes really, and with subjectivity, right? Like weird things matter, right? Like politics and things like that. They truly do matter in terms of making a judgment call on a particular person. That's why sometimes people get interesting jobs and other people don't. So that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of how PhD students are evaluated. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I do appreciate it. Try to be as helpful as I possibly can. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.